Imagine yourself on an endless plain, the sky stretching without a roof, and the horizon melting into the golden color of the sunset. A gentle wind blows, passing through the tall grasses as if whispering an ancient secret. In the distance, you hear the approaching hoofbeats of a horse. Here, the story begins, the story of men who lived their lives on horseback, made the open land their home, and adopted adventure as a way of life. They are the cowboys, the image of freedom in its simplest sense and the symbol of courage in the face of harsh nature. But behind the wide-brimmed hat and the untamed horses, there are stories yet to be fully told, stories of toil and patience, of danger and loneliness, and of a world that forged its own myths. In this documentary, we will leave the clamor of the cities behind and journey together to the Wild West. We will trace the footsteps of those men who became a global icon and discover how their hard work transformed into a living legend that still inspires films and stories today. When European feet first trod the lands of the New World in the 16th century, they brought with them all they knew of customs and ways of life. They arrived on a vast continent, full of endless pastures and wild herds that roamed the plains without limit. The land was fertile, but it needed someone to control it. Here began the first seed that would later grow into the cowboy legend. During that period, the Spanish colonists had brought their horses, animals previously unknown to the indigenous peoples. Mounted on these horses, Spanish farmers and adventurers began managing the vast lands. These men were known as vaqueros. They were skilled in raising cattle and in using long ropes to control runaway calves. They were not merely herders, they were true masters in the arts of horsemanship and herd control. As years passed, the expertise of the vaqueros spread north from Mexico into what would later become the United States. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these skills began to merge with the new reality of the American frontier. The climate was not easy, nor the roads paved. The new settlers needed men capable of facing nature and protecting their livestock. From this necessity, a new way of life was born, combining the skill of the Spanish vaqueros with the dream of freedom that Europeans sought in the New World. In states like Texas, the first true images of the cowboy appeared. There, the herder rode his horse from dawn, guiding cattle across vast expanses that could stretch for hundreds of kilometers. They lived in isolation, far from the towns, surrounded only by the sky and the plains. Although their life was harsh, it created an image of a lifestyle the world had never known before. The cowboy was not born in a single moment but was shaped over centuries of cultural exchange, the Spanish who planted the seed, the Mexicans who developed the style, and the settlers who made it a symbol of a land without borders. He was the legitimate child of adventure, born out of the need for survival, but he grew to become an icon of freedom. And so, when we hear the word cowboy today, we return in memory to those early days where civilizations met on the open range and where the features of a legend that will accompany the West forever were formed. While the birth of the cowboy marked the beginning of a grand tale, the details of his daily life were another world entirely, one worth exploring. With the first threads of dawn, when the fog still touches the cold grass, the cowboy wakes from a short sleep under the open sky or in a simple wooden shack. There is no time for long contemplation, life starts early. He tightens his belt and checks on his horse, his closest friend and companion every day. For him, the horse is not just a means but a whole life lived on its back, enduring fatigue just as its rider does. Before the sun is fully up, the cowboy prepares his gear, the saddle, the ropes, and some simple food to last the long day. There is no rest in this life, only constant movement between the plains and the valleys. With the sound of hooves striking the ground, the long day begins. The first task is often rounding up the cattle that scattered overnight. He whistles loudly or waves his rope to guide the herd back onto its path. Sometimes the cattle are dozens, sometimes hundreds, moving slowly through the dust. The cowboy must remain vigilant. No angry bull or runaway calf should escape his eye. The day is not easy. The sun can be scorching in the summer, its rays beating down on his back until his skin resembles the earth he walks on. In winter, the cold becomes a relentless enemy, biting at his hands and face. Yet, he must continue working. Rain, wind, or even snow, nothing stops the cowboy's day. During the long daylight hours, the cowboy covers dozens of kilometers on horseback, monitoring the herd, ensuring no one loses the way and no wolf or predator approaches the cattle. Sometimes he has to gallop quickly after a mischievous calf, and sometimes he must calm an angry bull threatening the rest of the herd. As the sun begins to set, the return to the camp starts. They rope the cattle in a designated area, light a fire, and eat what they carried with them. The meal is simple, some beans, hard bread, or dried meat. They sit around the fire, talking little or perhaps someone plays the harmonica, and then exhaustion overtakes them, and they sleep to the sounds of the night. Such was the life of the cowboy, constant vigilance, hard work, and more life spent on horseback than on the ground. They did not know comfort as city dwellers did, but they knew freedom in every breath of the prairie air. And so we close the page on a cowboy's day to reflect on the details of the simple tools he carried on his body and shoulders, tools that later became global symbols. The cowboy did not go to the range empty-handed. His life depended on a set of simple yet essential tools that became part of the image we know today. The first thing that catches the eye is the boot with the iron sole. It wasn't just ordinary footwear, it was armor that protected his feet from rocks and thorns and helped him brace himself in the saddle for long hours. On the back of the boot was a small metal piece called a spur, a tool the cowboy used to gently guide his horse. A slight nudge was enough to change direction or increase speed. Then comes the wide-brimmed hat, which was not mere adornment but a means to protect the face and eyes from the scorching Texas sun or the harsh winter rains. It was also used as a bowl for scooping water from a river or for fanning the fire in the camp. This hat later became a global symbol, making it difficult to mention the cowboy without picturing it on his head. As for the rope or lariat, lasso, it was the real weapon in the cowboy's hand. With it, he could catch a runaway calf, stop a wild bull, or even help a companion who had fallen from his horse. Skill in accurately throwing the rope was the mark that distinguished a good herder from others. Because the lasso was used daily, it eventually transformed into a symbol of power and control in the range life. In addition to these, the cowboy carried a small knife for cutting ropes or preparing food, and a simple pistol for protection. But these tools were not as linked to his fame as the hat, the boot, and the rope. Those three became the immortal trademarks by which the cowboy character is recognized anywhere in the world. Over the years, these tools transitioned from mere practical items to cultural symbols appearing in books, plays, and films. When we see a child wearing a wide hat or carrying a rope to play, we realize how the cowboy's gear has become part of the popular imagination, transcending the borders of the American West. But the tools were not the only thing that defined the cowboy's life. The vast ranges concealed many dangers, storms, wild animals, and outlaws, all faced by the herders in a daily struggle with nature. Life on the range was not just an arena for freedom, it was also a field of constant peril. Between the open plains and the vast sky, the cowboy faced the forces of nature, beasts, and man alike. The herder's greatest enemy was the storms. In summer, a clear sky could turn into a wall of black clouds within minutes. The wind would rage across the plains, lightning would strike the ground, and thunder would shake the herd, sending it into a chaotic stampede that could crush anyone in its path. The cowboy risked his life trying to control hundreds of panicked cattle. Sometimes, success meant saving the herd, failure meant losing an entire fortune. In winter, things were no better. Blizzards in the northern plains, especially in Dakota or Montana, would swallow the herds, burying them under the snow. Here, the herder faced not only the risk of freezing to death but also the responsibility of rescuing the livestock upon which the ranch owners depended for their livelihood. But nature was not the only foe. There were the predatory animals, wolves stalking the herd at night, cougars swooping down from the mountains, and sometimes bears attacking in search of food. In such moments, the cowboy had only his courage, his fast horse, and his simple pistol to protect himself and the livestock. The West was not free of the danger of humans either. Outlaws lurked, targeting the caravans transporting cattle to the markets. They would attack at night, firing shots to sow terror and attempting to steal cattle or money. Here, the cowboy had to transform from a herder into a fighter, guarding the herd as he would guard his own life. Despite all these dangers, the cowboy learned to rely on his survival skills, the ability to read the weather from the movement of clouds, knowledge of animal tracks on the ground, using fire to ward off wolves, and even cooperation among the herders themselves. All were means of protecting their lives and the lives of the herds. Courage was part of their day, not as a showy display of heroism but as an essential condition for survival. And so, amidst storms, beasts, and outlaws, the cowboy lived his life in constant confrontation with the unknown. Perhaps this is precisely why he became a symbol of bravery in the popular imagination, because he never knew the meaning of complete safety. But the West was not sustained by courage alone. While the cowboy faced dangers on the range, he also had to deal with law and justice in the small towns that sprang up on the edges of the plains. The plains were not the cowboy's only world. There were also the small towns that began to grow on the fringes of the range in the 19th century. These towns were built quickly, wooden houses, narrow, dust-covered streets, and a saloon at the heart of every settlement where men gathered after a long day. But beneath these appearances lay a bigger question: who enforces order in a land that does not yet know law? In that environment, the cowboy lived between two contrasting images. On one hand, he was sometimes viewed as an outlaw, an armed man who faced his opponents with his pistol at the first dispute. On the other hand, he was himself the guardian who helped caravans, escorted herds to the markets, and stood alongside lawmen to confront thieves and bandits. The cowboy was a symbol of freedom, but freedom in the West meant not only chaos but also a constant search for justice. Often, the absence of law turned simple disagreements into bloody confrontations. Disputes between farmers and herders over water or land could instantly turn into street shootouts. This is where the role of the sheriff or marshal, the man representing the law in the town, emerged. But the sheriff was not always able to maintain control alone, sometimes relying on the cowboy for help. One of the most famous stories that immortalized this role occurred in the 1870s in Dodge City, Kansas, where thousands of cattle passed through on their way to markets. Cattle rustling gangs were rampant there. Men like Sheriff Wyatt Earp and his brother Virgil appeared, confronting the outlaws. Loyal cowboys helped them track the thieves across the plains, using their tracking skills and knowledge of the cattle routes. The chase could last for days and nights, sometimes ending in an armed confrontation and other times with the gang's surrender before a shot was fired. However, the picture was not always rosy. Some cowboys turned into outlaws. They knew how to steal cattle without leaving a trace and sell them in other towns under different names. Hence came the dual image of the cowboy, the honorable guardian or the lawbreaker. As the years passed, the law gradually became established in those towns. Small courthouses, sheriff's offices, and even simple wooden jails became symbols of the attempt to impose order. Yet, the cowboy remained present in the scene, either as the arm of the law or as an adversary standing against it. The cowboy contributed to shaping the identity of the American West. He was not just a man living on the range but a part of the nascent society, with a role in protecting the frontier and maintaining security. Perhaps this is why he remained in the popular imagination as a mysterious character, carrying a mix of freedom and courage, but also of rebellion and danger. Although the law defined the contours of town life, the most exciting stories came from the men who became icons and legends. Their stories did not remain confined to reality but passed into books and tales that captivated the public imagination. In the American West, not all cowboys were the same. Some lived ordinary lives on the range, while others turned into legendary figures whose names were immortalized in books, plays, and films. Their lives were a blend of fact and fiction, making it sometimes difficult to distinguish between what truly happened and what was created by the popular imagination. One of the most prominent of these was Wild Bill Hickok. Born in the mid-19th century, he was famous for his shooting skill and speed, which made him a true legend. He sometimes worked as a lawman protecting small towns and sometimes as a professional gambler in saloons. Wild Bill was killed in 1876 while playing cards. Since that day, his story has been linked to the dead man's hand, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, said to be the cards in his hand at the moment of his death. Pat Garrett's name is associated with the pursuit of one of the most dangerous outlaws of the time, Billy the Kid. After a long chase across the New Mexico desert, Garrett managed to kill Billy in 1881. This event became a symbol of the eternal struggle between justice and anarchy in the West. Pat Garrett became a hero in the eyes of some and a cruel man in the view of others. But the most famous event that amplified the legend of the Wild West occurred in a small town called Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881. A famous gunfight known as the Gunfight at the OK Corral erupted. The fight lasted less than half a minute but was enough to immortalize the names of its participants. On the side of the law stood Sheriff Wyatt Earp and his brothers, along with their friend Doc Holliday. On the other side were the Clanton brothers and some outlaws. They exchanged fire in a narrow alley amidst the screams of the people and the rising dust. Some fell dead, and others survived, but the event itself became a symbol of the struggle between order and chaos in the Wild West. Buffalo Bill Cody embodied the legend in a different way. He was not merely a cowboy but a man who managed to turn his experience into a grand show with which he toured across the United States and Europe. In his Wild West shows, he presented theatrical scenes of battles with Native Americans, and displays of horsemanship and rope throwing. Thanks to him, the image of the cowboy reached millions of people who had never set foot in the American West but lived it through their imagination. These personalities and events did not remain confined to the West, they transformed into cultural icons. Historians wrote about them, poets sang of them, and their stories were told around campfires and in the pages of popular novels. Over time, names like Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, Buffalo Bill, and the gunfight at the OK Corral became part of the mythology that shaped the image of the Wild West in the minds of people around the world. But the legend did not stop with books and tales. With the beginning of the 20th century, the cowboy entered a new world that would immortalize his image forever. With the dawn of the 20th century, cowboy stories were no longer confined to the ranges or popular books but found their way onto a new screen that captivated the world: cinema. From the earliest silent films in the first decade of the 20th century, directors began to redraw the image of the Wild West, where the cowboy confronted outlaws amidst the dust and the creaking of wooden doors. In 1903, a short film titled The Great Train Robbery was produced, considered one of the first films to feature scenes of the West. The film was not long, but it opened the door for dozens of works that made the cowboy a cinematic hero. A few years later, black and white films appeared, presenting the image of the noble cowboy, the man who lived by a code of honor, protected the weak, and stood against the villains. In the 1940s and 1950s, Western films reached their peak popularity. Actors like John Wayne and Gary Cooper became familiar faces, and the sound of hoofbeats and gunfire in the streets became part of the audience's memory. In that era, the film was not just entertainment but a tool to highlight values like courage, justice, and persistence. But over time, the image changed. In the 1960s, what became known as the Italian Western or spaghetti Western emerged, led by directors like Sergio Leone. In these films, the cowboy was not an idealized hero but a more enigmatic character living in a world where good and evil were mixed. The distinctive music of Ennio Morricone and faces like Clint Eastwood made these films immortal in cinematic memory. Even in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the cowboy's image did not lose its luster. New films like Unforgiven, 1992, or There Will Be Blood, 2007, offered a re-examination of the Western myth from different, more realistic, and harsher angles. Thus, the cowboy transitioned from the real ranges to the cinema screens around the world, becoming a cultural icon not just for the United States but a global symbol of freedom and a life lived between adventure and solitude. However, the cowboy's world was not a world of men alone. Behind the famous image of the hat and saddle, there were women who played important roles in the ranches, towns, and journeys. When we hear the word cowboy, a man in a wide-brimmed hat riding a horse through the dust and ranges comes to mind. But behind this image, women had an important presence in the life of the West, a presence that may not have been highlighted often but was an essential part of the story. On the remote ranches, women worked side by side with the men, milking cows, preparing food for the herders, and caring for the children amidst a harsh environment. They did not have the luxury of rest or a stable life. Life on the frontier was a daily struggle for survival. Nevertheless, many women were able to prove their strength and patience, making their presence an indispensable element in the cowboy's world. There were also women famous for their courage, such as some adventurers who rode horses and were skilled marksmen. Some worked as travelers or even as fighters when needed. Stories like those of Calamity Jane showed that women were not always passive figures but sometimes participated in adventures no less exciting than those of the men. In the small towns, women played another role, that of the teacher, doctor, and nurturer. In an era where the law was not stable, they were a symbol of stability and order. Their presence in schools, churches, and homes gave another meaning to life in the West and allowed the towns to grow from mere rest stops into real communities. But between reality and legend, the image of women changed. In some popular tales and films, she appeared as a symbol of tenderness and love awaiting the cowboy's return from the range. In other stories, she was presented as a symbol of strength and adventure, standing side by side with the man. This duality made the image of women in the West rich and diverse, no less important than the image of the cowboy himself. The women of the West were a quiet yet present voice, adding a human dimension to the story amidst a world full of struggle and isolation. Without them, the picture of the Wild West as we know it today would not be complete. But there were bigger changes looming on the horizon, changes that no one, neither men nor women, could stop. Changes that began with the arrival of trains and barbed wire. As every era is born, the time of the cowboy had to recede. In the second half of the 19th century, the major changes began that turned life on the range upside down. The first of these changes was the railroad. With the expansion of railway lines across the plains after 1860, it became possible to transport cattle quickly from ranches to distant markets without the need for long journeys on horseback. Herds no longer traveled hundreds of kilometers along dirt trails but were loaded into train cars and sped toward the industrial cities. With every new rail line, the cowboy's traditional role was shortened. Then came the barbed wire to change the face of the range. In the 1870s, farmers invented a simple and cheap way to fence land. The wire was like an invisible wall stretching for long distances, preventing cattle from roaming freely and putting an end to the world of the open range. This innovation ended a long conflict between farmers who wanted to protect their crops and herders who were accustomed to common pastures. As it spread, the role of the cowboy, who relied on leading herds across boundless spaces, diminished. Besides that, the economy itself changed. Cities were growing rapidly, and factories demanded more regular and stable products. The image of the solitary herder leading the herd across the plains no longer suited the new era. The organized farmer, the railroads, and the large markets were now driving the scene. In some areas, the cowboys resisted these changes. Conflicts erupted between herders and farmers, sometimes called the fence-cutting wars, or barbed wire wars. These were violent disputes that occurred in states like Texas during the 1880s when herders tried to preserve the open range. But in the end, they could not stop the wheel of time. With the beginning of the 20th century, the era of the traditional cowboy receded. He was no longer a symbol of daily work on the range as he had been before, but gradually transformed into a cultural icon, carried by popular memory more than by reality. Nevertheless, his presence did not completely end but continued in another form through stories, legends, and shows that kept his image alive. As we reach the end of the cowboy story, we discover that we are not just telling the tale of a profession but of a whole era that reshaped history. The story began in the 16th century when horses came from Spain to the New World, and with them, a new type of man was born, living on the plains and facing nature with courage and silence. The cowboy was not merely a herder, he was a symbol of freedom and an image of the man who tested his strength in the face of the unknown. He faced storms and beasts, protected the herd, and contributed to building small towns amidst the vast wilderness. Over time, his story became a legend, around which tales were woven and which cinema immortalized in the hearts of millions. When his time receded with the introduction of trains and barbed wire in the late 19th century, his spirit did not disappear. It came back to life in rodeo shows and in every film that returns his voice to the horizon and his image to the light. Today, more than 100 years later, the cowboy remains a symbol of adventure, courage, and freedom. And when we hear the wind passing through the grasses or the distant sound of a horse's hooves, we feel as if his spirit is still there, walking silently between the dust and memory, between fact and legend.